There are some video games whose writing is invisible, which don't place plotting and characterization in an obvious and conventional context. Dragon Age is not one of those game series. The last time we covered these games, we had occasion to dig into world building and storytelling through the context of how video games structure their gameplay to accommodate storylines. And while that design aspect of the conversation is worthy of a return, I'd also like to schedule an intimate detour through the character writing of the Dragon Age series to make what I see as maybe a less popular, but still deeply provocative observation about video games and gay relationships. I'd like to do at least a trilogy of short videos like this about special characters who fit the bill, so if that sounds like something you'd find appealing, stick around. This is a discourse and diagnosis on being gay in Dragon Age. First, a little catch-up since our last discussion of this game. Dragon Age Origins allows for, as the title suggests, the player to play through different character backgrounds to start off their story. Although most of the beats of the story thereafter will be the same, you can start with a few different character origins, such as a mage, a human noble, a city elf, a forest elf, a commoner dwarf, or a noble dwarf. There are other races in Dragon Age, and those summaries don't really nail what makes those origins compelling. My three favorites are the city elf living in the slums and fighting back against an abusive human supremacist racial order, the noble dwarf dealing with backstabbing, court intrigue, and the mage undergoing trials and discovering blood rituals, in that order. But regardless of where we begin, we'll arrive at our destination the same way. We need to play through the first part of the story that sets up the main conflict, acquire our earliest companions, and beat at least one of the main story quests after this point. This all sounds fun, but unremarkable for a fantasy story. Dragon Age has, as I've discussed before, a lot of compelling storytelling as well as world building, and in particular, one of my favorite elements is the story of religious conflict in the world of Thedas, which draws heavily on real human history for inspiration. The writing plays with a few key elements of religious conflict, like the distinctions in the historical roles of animistic, polytheist, or monotheistic god worship, the emergence of a Christian analog from an older religion that was itself rooted in a monotheistic faith divesting itself from a polytheistic faith, martyrdom and Christ-like moral plays, multiple analogs for the social role of Christian anti-Semitism, and the many, many ways religion and God belief motivate individual people across history and culture. Other elements of the world, especially racial conflict and ideas of magical practices, play into conflicts around religious themes. This is all of interest specifically because one of the handfuls of draws of the Dragon Age games is relationships, both romantic and sexual. Anti-gay stigma in Dragon Age is filtered out, at least for the most of the first two games, by virtue of the setting in Ferelden and the Free Marshes. There isn't a lot of sympathetic Tevinter representation until the third game, and Tevinter appears to be the nation with some of the greater examples of anti-gay stigma, so that theme has been a slow trickle across the series. In the two aforementioned settings, there's some passive avoidance of the subject of gay relationships, and this isn't to say that those settings are totally accepting of same-sex relationships, but this doesn't seem totally strange for a feudal setting where marriage specifically would likely be a matter of passing down inheritance via social conventions of primogeniture or favoritism towards the eldest male child of the family. However, even this practice seems to be limited, or so the narratives would suggest, because Dragon Age frequently positions women in major leadership roles, both politically and spiritually. Even the closest thing the series has to a Christ analog was a woman who perished in a death more similar to Joan of Arc than the biblical Christ. In general, the suggestion of homophobia and motivations for homophobia in the first two games is limited, is what I'm trying to say. On the other hand, players have had the opportunity to be in same-sex relationships from the very first game onward. This frequent stamp of approval from players comes with a technicality. We'll talk more in the future about how this practice would later be changed, but for our purposes, we need to talk about romance options in Dragon Age Origins. There are a few non-options from among the companions. In the base game, there are a number of companions whose arcs involve being bound for death. Sten is rescued from what may as well be a death sentence and pledges himself to fight until victory or death against the Darkspawn, should the player choose to recruit him. Wynne is recruited from the Circle of Magi Tower but carries a secret. Her life is only sustained temporarily by a spirit possessing her, and her time and strength are limited. Oghren is a drunk on a near-suicidal quest whom the player may aid and recruit, but he never really recovers from his unwell state, only stabilizes, shifting from one quest of certain death to another. Loghain is only recruited to the Grey Wardens as opposed to receiving another worse punishment, but that service is for life, and he will die at some point as a result, sooner or later. The dog is, a dog. He goes where you go, the bedroom accepted. This leaves 4 romanceable base game companions. Your heterosexually locked options are Morrigan and Alistair, a mean lady and a nice gentleman, if that's your speed. I'd normally make some joke here about how Morrigan being available to only male characters is some kind of anti-lesbian homophobia, lesbophobia, for the more well-acquainted. But in truth, I've never found heterosexual audiences to be all that receptive to humor that positions them as the butt of the joke, where language like that is involved. Still, Liliana is available to female characters if the player is looking for a same-sex option. The catch here is that technically she's written to be bisexual, romanceable by either male or female player characters. This isn't a bad thing, but it is a little conspicuous that the only locked options are the straight ones, and it took until the 3rd game to get anything like that for gay characters. But we're missing someone, aren't we? I've heard players praise the romances with Alistair, Morrigan, and Liliana, but I hear less and less about Zevran as the years go by. Part of this may be his relative popularity. One survey of Reddit users of the Dragon Age subreddit seems to suggest he's the least popular romance option of the 4. I have a sort of suspicion, based on reasons we'll cover in a future video, that even well-written characters in male homosexual relationships may be less popular, though that wouldn't entirely explain why female characters wouldn't romance Zevran. I suppose, next to snarky Alistair, whose heart of gold and hidden heritage is a critical plot point, it's hard for Zevran to hold a candle. In a lot of ways, Zevran is a stereotype. He's from Antiva, a relatively wealthy land with a kind of mixed Italian and Spanish heritage. He's a charming and flirtatious assassin who is certainly up some people's avenue, and I don't doubt it, but for the only queer male love interest in the game, Zevran comes off a bit one-note and stereotypical at first. For the only expressly bisexual man, or gay man, or queer man in the party to be a kind of hypersexual dashing rogue isn't so much a negative stereotype as it is a stereotype nonetheless. I don't think anyone could deny cultural charges of bisexual man being more inclined to sexual behavior up to and including both kink and BDSM stereotypes, and the fact that Zevran can actually betray you towards the end of the game, which fulfills a kind of extreme version of the idea that bisexual men or queer men in general are duplicitous, either out of a need to quench insatiable sexual desires or out of a kind of cattiness fulfilling a feminine stereotype, is in and of itself worth mentioning. It's not that people like that don't exist, but it's a cruel misapprehension of what it means to be queer in the first place. So when you add this together with the frankly emotional offense of Zevran introducing himself to you by trying to kill you, and potentially betraying you to try to do so again, it's hard to see at a surface level what a lot of people might see in the character. But we don't talk about Zevran. The real Zevran is a person behind a series of masks. He's your assassin, then he's your traveling companion, then he's your friend, then he's your friend with benefits, then finally he's your lover should you make a certain series of choices. The thing about Zevran is that I've never actually heard anyone compare him to Morrigan, but they're astonishingly similar as characters. Liliana and Alistair have always struck me as characters who an arrogant player might misunderstand, but if given a chance, they show their heart of gold relatively easily. Morrigan, on the other hand, is a witch. She isn't just a smelly spellcaster and a heartless harpy, she's a social outcast as well. She understands the world on transactional terms for 2 chief reasons. That's what's gotten her this far, and it's how she hides her vulnerabilities. The secret is that if you act like you don't care and put enough distance between yourself and other people, eventually you can overwrite your empathy to a significant degree, and that's a real survival instinct when it's you against the world. Zevran has lived that kind of life. He was supposedly the child of a Dalish elf woman and an alienage elf man, the 2 chief backgrounds for elves, which can see them living in various rural settings on their own terms, or in mostly human cities in the slums. It's not an obvious choice. The Dalish have been unable to preserve their heritage to the degree that they aren't the original elvish societies that existed in the world of Thedas. They're not even the societies that existed secondarily or tertiarily to those lost mythical civilizations. In a sense, both types of elvish communities live in the ruins of other civilizations. That sense of something lost and unknowable exists at a personal level for Zevran, because he lost his parents both at a young age and was raised in a brothel before being sold to an order of assassins. In a manner that speaks to the strong writing of these games, Zevran doesn't joke around because he's hiding real pain. He's also using the humor to live through a painful experience actively. It's not just a veil, it's a cast. There's a telling moment that you can get randomly if you travel a lot with Alistair and Zevran both in your party. Characters in the party will banter if you bring them to walk with you during missions, probably one of the most charming features of BioWare's party RPGs. Alistair wants to get a tattoo, like the one Zevran has. Zevran's tattoos are interesting. They're similar to the ones the Dalish have, which they treat with a ritual significance, but which unbeknownst to them are later revealed to be derivative of tattoos placed on slaves, ironically similar to the markings some Tevinter slavers put on their slaves. Zevran's tattoos seemingly come from the practices of his order of assassins, the Antivan Crows, but Antiva, like many regions in Thedas, was formerly controlled by Tevinter, an infamous slave empire, and Zevran was himself purchased as a slave. There's a kind of unity to this narrative told simply in his face tattoos. His body is not his. Zevran's reaction to this, from his playful quips to his open sexuality, is a surprisingly human one. The surprise doesn't come from him being an elf, but rather from how stories so easily fall into portraying people who have their autonomy taken away from them, either in terms of prescribing for them the opposite behavior, chastity as opposed to eroticism, or moralizing to cast their sexual response to a bodily violation as the behavior of the traumatized, an unhealthy impulse to be unlearned. The issue with this, obviously, isn't that hypersexuality can't be unhealthy, it can, or that it can't result from trauma, it often does, but rather that there is ultimately nothing necessarily wrong in using eroticism to respond to a lack of personal autonomy. In fact, from short stories about Zevran's past, you can piece together that connecting with people physically in sex or murder is basically how he directed his own life until you came along, and after you come along, those are still his chief methods. Zevran likes killing, and he's good at it. Zevran likes sex, and he's good at it. What we experience in his story is a subtle but unashamed willingness to look our culture right back in its own judgmental gaze and say, yes, that is my story, those things were done to me, but I am still making these choices now because I want to, and I am not wrong. There are a few story moments with Zevran that stick out. These are, in general, normal for a Dragon Age game, but with Zevran these moments can feel understated. He wishes he had a pair of Antivan leather boots, and when you get some for him, the experience of receiving them at all is what he finds the most shocking. His mother was Dalish, so when you give him a nice pair of Dalish gloves, his dialogue sounds almost like he's remembering her, entertaining a past that he never really got to experience. Zevran doesn't really miss what he never had, but neither is he incapable of yearning for it. Zevran is a character who defies vulgar categorization. He's above being a stereotype because he refuses to be pinned down, and he's above the judgment of others because he lives on his own terms. The existence of Zevran in this game, in this setting, in this story, means something powerful and provocative for the emotional maturity and depth of the series, and I think having played through it and experienced it when I otherwise wouldn't have, has given me an appreciation for that. Ultimately, queer representations and characterizations offer a unique opportunity in relationships. They can push against preconceptions in two different directions. I think that's part of what it really means to queer a cultural idea. When I think of sexuality in storytelling in modern gaming, I think of Zevran, and all the potential his existence implies.